Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Robotyne, where there's a lot of dynamic fighting. The Russians and the Ukrainians are moving back and forth throughout the front line as there's a lot of positional fighting, but there's been no developments in this section of the front line as the Russians continue to try and push on and the Ukrainians are able to hold their positions with fierce resistance. Moving on to the Velika Nevesilka direction and Volda direction, we see this advance by the Russians to the north of Shevchenkova. In the Ukrainian summer offensive, there was a few advances by the Ukrainians here to the southwest of Avdiivka, where they were moving in the direction of Shevchenkova, but the Russians managed to hold on to the village and are now counterattacking, recapturing some of the positions lost. And with this, there is a duplicated footage of this advance by the Russians, showing the Russians making this advance and the Ukrainians trying to fight back and launch some artillery strikes on a Russian armored convoy. So we're seeing that there are some usage of armored vehicles by the Russians here in the fields to the southwest of Avdiivka, and they have managed to advance and capture some of these fields to the north of Shevchenkova, adding up to 3.5 kilometers. We then move on to the Novomikhailivka direction, where there's been no significant developments within this town. There's continuous positional fighting similar to the Robotyne direction, and as such a lot of fighting is taking place, but not really much frontline movement. Here in the direction of Pobieda, the Russians managed to advance further and now have control over about a third of the village. With this advancement, the Russians now have a foothold within their village and are fighting over the rest of it. We may see the Russians gain full control over it soon. If the fighting succeeds for the Russians, they will be able to take control over the village. They will establish their front line here by Pobieda and next to the road. This will allow the Russians to develop the situation in a southern direction and flank the villages of Konstantinivka, Pereskovivka, and Novomikhailivka from the north. It will also solidify the Russian control over the northern eastern parts, as the Ukrainians would have a difficult time resupplying them, considering their positions here in the northeast of Novomikhailivka, where the Russians are fighting heavily in that town, and the Ukrainians would have no paved supply roads to that position. The current position right now, we have that the Ukrainians would resupply from the Pereskovivka direction. If the Russians move in a southern direction and cut off this road, then the Ukrainians to the east of it would have no resupply options. As such, the direction of Pobieda, the fighting there has an impact on the fighting in Novomikhailivka, and if the Russians gain control of it, they can start attacking Novomikhailivka from the north, which they so far have failed to gain proper control of to allow them to attack from the northern direction. And with this, we see that Pobieda is on the brink of falling to the Russian forces with their foothold within the village. In the northeastern direction towards Nevelske, fighting continues here, and it is of the positional nature here as well as in the direction of Pervomaiske. Here to the west of Avdiivka, there is this map update. More so than an update, it is rather a map correction, as the Russians have control over the area here to the west of the citadel area, and with this the Russians are closer to Sheverne from the east, and they also have pushed the Ukrainians back from the forest lines here to the south of Lestoshkine, which means that the only threat to the Russian positions east of the village is in the western direction. So the Russians are really fighting the Ukrainians in just one direction. The Ukrainians are trying to hold on to the village of Lestoshkine by sending resupplies and reinforcements to that section of the front line. The Ukrainians have numerous brigades in this section of the front line. There is this picture here, which is captured from a still frame photo of a speech between Shoigu and Putin, where they talk about the Battle of Avdiivka. And we can see here, this is Lestoshkine. This is the whole red area here is Avdiivka. The citadel area is right here. And as such, we see that the developments and frontline has been shown through this mapping, and from this we see that there are numerous brigades of the Ukrainians here to the south, while not so many here to the north. This is likely due to the fact that if we take a look at the front line, in the southern direction there's both the village of Lestoshkine, but also Severne and Tonenke, which means that there's a significant amount of Ukrainian soldiers here in the southern parts, trying to hold these villages to the west of Avdiivka, while in the northern parts there is the line of Berdishi, Semenivka, and Orlivka, which are outside of the frame, so the Ukrainian soldiers in the north are further away. This means that the Ukrainians have a significant focus or concentration of forces here to the south by Sheverne, Notenenke, and Lestoshkine, and the Russians are fighting in that direction head-on against these brigades. This is why we see that the Ukrainians, who are just left Avdiivka, they have just fought and they surrendered the city, are still able to hold on to the villages to the west of Avdiivka. This is because they have a significant amount of troops in the area. There is this geolocated footage in the direction of Lestoshkine, which confirms the Russian foothold within the village here to the eastern parts, and in it we see that their footage accompanying this geolocation shows 4 Russian armored vehicles destroyed here to the east of Lestoshkine, and with this we see that the Ukrainians are still able to withdraw from Avdiivka, but set up a significant defensive position to the west of the village, and the Russians are pressing on, trying to take advantage of the developments of the capture of Avdiivka, preventing the Ukrainians from properly settling into these villages and try to push them further away. So there's a lot of heavy fighting taking place to the west of Avdiivka. Despite the end of the battle of the Avdiivka itself, it has now moved to the western parts. And at the same time, considering that they are now fighting in the open fields and away from the city itself, a significant portion of the Ukrainian soldiers and the Russian soldiers will be freed up from the Battle of Avdiivka. The Ukrainians are still hanging around to prevent the Russians from taking advantage of this gain and developing the situation further. However, the Russians have already started sending their soldiers elsewhere, namely the Bahmut direction and the Zaporizhia front. In these 2 directions, the Russians have sent reinforcements from Avdiivka after the end of the battle. We'll likely see that in the coming days, the Russians will continue their operations here to the west of Avdiivka, as well as in the direction of Nevelsky, where they'll try to capture the village, but they'll likely focus more of their attention towards Pervomaisky, as they already have a foothold within that town, while in Nevelsky they have to go through these open fields and minefields. To the south, in the direction of Pobieda, the fighting will continue until the Russians gain control over the village, as the Russians have already gained a foothold within the farm areas to the west of the village before, but now the Russians have a proper foothold within the village, and as such they'll likely not give up this opportunity to take control of it, especially since the Ukrainian reinforcements would have to go through large heaps of fields to arrive at Pobieda. This means that the Ukrainians would have a difficult time to actually send reinforcements and resupply the village. As such, the Russians will likely take a lot of attention and focus to capture the village. In the direction of Novomikhailivka, the situation will develop, as well as the rest of the southern front. Moving up north in the direction of Bahmut, the fighting continues here. It's very positional. The Russians, with the control over all of the fortifications and forest lines to the east and to the north of the village, are preparing for an assault. As such, they are waiting for reinforcements to come from Avdiivka and other areas so that they are ready to take control over Ivanivsky. They're likely looking to take control over it quickly instead of a drawn-out battle, because the position of Ivanivsky is actually profitable and detrimental to the Russians, profitable for the Ukrainians, as they have the canal line here to the west of it. So a quick capture would allow the Russians to essentially cut off the Ukrainians in their retreat out of the village if they're pushing them out of it, and prevent them from actually crossing over the canal. However, in a drawn-out battle, the Ukrainians can do a slow withdrawal across the canal, which would be much safer for them, especially if they can walk through the forest patches here to the northwest of the village. As such, the Russians will look to cut off the supply route to prevent a withdrawal, or simply capture the village in a fast way. The issue for the Ukrainians with the Ivanivsky is it's also difficult to send reinforcements to the section of the front line, because if they need significant reinforcements, it would have to come from over the canal, and the Russians can use that as a point where they can launch attacks towards the Ukrainian positions trying to cross over. The likely and reasonable way to send reinforcements would be to take out the forces from Klishchivka and Avdiivka and simply send them north to Ivanivsky. However, the Russians will take advantage of that and take attacks towards these 2 villages and take control of them. Klishchivka and Avdiivka are pretty much the same as Robotyne, in the sense that everything is completely destroyed and there's pretty much no standing buildings in either of those 2 villages, and as such it is likely that the Russians do not plan on getting a foothold within them, but simply capturing the fortifications and forest patches besides them to be able to hold on to those positions. In the northern direction towards the west of Kreminna and the Sinkivka direction, there's no significant developments. It's continuous positional fighting, as most of the front line is right now. The Russians are rotating their forces around a lot throughout the whole front line, as they're sending additional forces to the Zaporizhia front from Avdiivka to the southern front towards Volodara, Novomikhailivka, Pobieda, in the northern direction towards Bahmut, Kreminna, and Kupiansk. There's also an influx of additional forces from outside of the fighting zone The Russians are claiming so far that 50,000 volunteers have signed up for the Russian army in 2024, which is continuing the pace of last year, where it's about 1,000 soldiers a day admitting to the Russian army by volunteer status. And as such, there's continuous influx of additional soldiers for the Russians, and they can just continuously build up their army despite the attrition at the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.